Howdy, y'all. Welcome to True Lying Film Discussion. Because films lie to tell the truth, or some truth, or a truth. Ain't that something?
Eco-Cinema Part 3. George C. Scott's Rage. In praise of the non-activist type. Regarded by most film historians as one of the strongest periods in American cinema, the 1970s is an overstuffed, overcrowded decade. We have obvious touchstones from the time, then many diamonds in the rough, and then some truly hidden gems. 1972's Rage, starring the formidable George C. Scott, is one of these hidden gems. Even the most thorough of film buffs may have missed this one. I only discovered it by happy accident while doing research about eco-conspiracy films, which is most certainly the genre it calls home, but it finds a home there in a way I hope to argue is actually quite unique for its time. Counter-counterculture. Rage is not totally ignored in discussions of conspiracy thrillers, but it is something of a footnote. One of the reasons for this is the same thing that makes it unique, namely, its resolutely counter-counterculture aura. Although the story is a protest of sorts against government mismanagement and the deleterious effects of chemical weapons manufacturing on the natural world, it is not a hippie film. Our main character does not smoke pot and probably hates potheads. He does not have the long hair of idealistic youth, and he is not a peacenik like Freeman Lowell in Silent Running. Rather, he is a rancher, all hat and denim and farm living. His choice of attire, much like Harry Callahan's grey herringbone tweed in Dirty Harry, or John Wintergreen's highway patrol shades in Electra-Glide in Blue, or Travis Bickle's M65 field jacket in Taxi Driver, was not in vogue amongst the bell-bottom and tie-dye set of the 60s and 70s. Although not wearing the uniform of social progressivism, he does find himself fighting the man, but from a decidedly more conservative, even libertarian mode of living. George C. Scott, described by biographer David Sheward as, quote, independently conservative, end quote, is an actor with a face that looks more like Make War Not Love than Make Love Not War, and is a perfect aesthetic complication precisely for this reason. More curiously, Scott is also the film's director, a surprise to me, as I thought this familiar presence in cinema was only ever a fixture in front of the camera. We all know George C. Scott from Patton, Dr. Strangelove, Hardcore, and The Changeling, but who knew he donned the director's cap for 2 feature-length films? What attracted Scott to this material? Roger Ebert thought that Rage was, quote, obviously a personal project with which he felt great identification, end quote. It would be a mistake to not read Scott's personal politics into the film. This might confound some people who have a habit of equating environmentalism with left-leaning intelligentsia and student activism. The perception of eco-concern as being the righteous cause of tree-hugging liberals was pronounced in the 60s and 70s. As a point of interest, the term tree hugger appears to have been popularized in its derisive form in the 70s. It seems to me that Scott rejects this framing and finds a way to raise concerns from a more right-leaning perspective about our position within nature. It is worth noting that his second and final film as director, The Savage is Loose, also has explicit environmental themes. Scott even expressed a desire to direct Harrow Alley from a screenplay by Walter Brown Newman about a community surviving plague-stricken London. Unfortunately, any chance of a George C. Scott environmental triptych was unrealized. But there is undeniable and surprising thematic interest here from a man who looks as if he would rather be at the bar than at the barricade of a protest. Reactionary ecologies of the counterculture. There are other films from this time period that have been described, usually negatively, as reactionary or backlash films, which depict the concerns of what was called the silent majority, the no-nonsense racialism found in the likes of Dirty Harry or The French Connection, are city ecologies, which are, to a large extent, responses to real problems of urban crime and its often unfortunate racial realities. So, too, was Rage a response to a very real incident outside of the city, a case of environmental disaster occurring just 4 years earlier, known as the Dugway sheep incident. The opening sequences of Rage show a type of service of the common man. We can see that the father and son are custodians of the land. They have a knowledge of this way of life and are clearly using their dominion over the animals wisely and compassionately. They interact with dogs, sheep, and even a centipede with a reflective humility that feels like they are part of some bigger natural order. The music during these moments is corny, but this actually adds an innocence to the proceedings. Because the father is part of this great chain of being and knows his place within it, he naturally defers to authority as well. When his son suddenly and mysteriously falls ill after they spend the night camping, he rushes him to the hospital, passing the scattered bodies of sheep as he goes. He talks to doctors politely and calls them sir and ma'am. He assumes that because they are medical professionals, they have the best interests of him, his son, and the larger community at heart. To invoke the recent COVID crisis, he trusts the science. At least he does initially, before he finds out the doctors are part of a larger government conspiracy involving chemical weapons testing over part of his farmland. The Dugway sheep incident. The real-world incident occurred in 1968 in snow-covered Skull Valley, western Utah. The local sheriff on the scene reported the following, quote, "Sheep laying all over, all of them down, patches of white as far as you could see," end quote. Details from the Salt Lake Tribune report describe, quote, "a frightening scene of convulsing sheep and a near hysterical shepherd," end quote. The use of a nerve agent from the nearby Dugway Proving Ground, an army base for biological weapons testing, had resulted in the death of over 6,000 sheep. The symbolic shock of this has biblical resonance, suggestive of the failure of man to take on the mantle of Lord as shepherd. The pastoral care of the farmer to his flock extends also to the broader needs of the community. Sometimes this effort of care is disrupted by a variety of different so-called natural evils, such as disease, for example, blue tongue virus, or drought. But in this case, it is a more condemnable moral evil. The incident left the people of Utah with a lasting distrust of the government. As the Salt Lake Tribune reports, quote, "The Dugway sheep incident is loaded with symbolic value in Utah. It is brought up regularly at public hearings as one of 2 reasons Utahns distrust the Army and, to a lesser degree, all other federal agencies. The other frequently cited cause of federal distrust is lies about the safety of open-air nuclear weapons testing at the Nevada test site in the 1950s and 1960s that sent clouds of radioactive fallout drifting into Utah." End quote. Luckily, no people were killed during the incident. Scott's film makes a dramatic deviation from this fact. but according to doctors' examinations, quote, at least one Skull Valley rancher who ate snow during this period has complained of chronic health problems since the incident, end quote. The importance of the non-activist type. As a closing point, I think rage is mostly successful in the way it acts as a counterweight to some liberal perceptions of environmentalism. Unfortunately, it did not really seem to find an audience upon its release, and exists in semi-obscurity today. This is partly due to studio interference, but also George C. Scott's apparent inability to compromise with anyone at all, eventually leading him to not even attending the screening of the first rough cut. Surprisingly, it might be a film like Steven Soderbergh's Erin Brockovich, released many years later, that succeeds where Rage failed. The landmark legal case in Erin Brockovich, inspired by the toxic contamination of groundwater by Pacific Gas and Electric, follows a similarly ordinary individual who fights against corporate mismanagement and ecological conspiracy, although Julia Roberts does not resort to gun-toting vigilantism like George C. Scott does. Unlike Rage, Erin Brockovich made a handsome amount at the box office and managed to find a huge audience to promote its message. Even the success of Michael Mann's The Insider, with a focus on the tobacco industry, big agriculture, and the whistleblowing of the painfully normal Jeffrey Wigand, goes to show that audiences are willing and ready to engage with figures more at home on the counter-countercultural side of things. In short, ecological concern does not, and perhaps should not, be predicated on appealing to activist types.